Thank you for coming. I have a lot of demos. That's what I prefer when I attend sessions. So I will do a lot of demos, but we do have some slides to go through. A little bit about me. I am Microsoft MVP within Data Platform, primarily focusing on Power BI. I'm a partner at Catman Solution. I used to run the Danish Power BI user group, but I don't do that anymore. I have handed that over to a colleague of mine. If you are interested in Danish contemporary art, I would like to talk to you about that, because I collect art actually as well. Not only Power BI visuals, but real art. And if you want to connect, please reach out on Twitter or LinkedIn. But that's pretty much how old I am. My first certification within Microsoft is actually from 1997, where I had the opportunity to get certified in Microsoft Excel 5.0. And boy, did I wish that, or girl, did I wish that I had Power Query back then. Back then I worked with MS Query, and one of the main reasons why I switched from being an accountant to a Excel VBA developer, etc., was actually because my boss back then didn't want to spend money in an ODBC driver for connecting data to the ERP system. And life was too short for that. So I switched career and moved into Excel world. But today we are going to talk about how we can get data from different web APIs into Power BI. And this is a list of web APIs we hopefully will all manage to get through. I have some bonus points at the end. The Open API, ChatGPT, whatever. I will perhaps show you, if I have time, how we can actually ask a question within Power BI and get the answer back. But otherwise, we will have a look at the crime data in this area, how we can get that information, how we can get data from Dataverse, how we can get data from our ERP system that exposes a REST API. In that, we will have a look at how we paginate things. And another way of authenticating, which is probably one of the hardest things to do when we get data out of web APIs, is to use the example from Spotify, where we can get data out of Spotify. And last, the Power BI admin REST API, perhaps a small competitor if you don't want to pay for Power BI Sentinel, but it will give you a hint of what you can actually do with REST APIs as well here. But you do get a lot more from the Sentinel product. But if we have a look at the documentation, how do we get data out of the web? We have a function called web.contents, and it has some arguments. It has two. It has one required, that's the URL, and it has some options as well. And I do believe that there are 3 different examples of getting data out of the web, where they specify what to use the options for. And it took me quite a while to understand what is actually this. So hopefully you will get a head start after today. The main part that you should be aware of is this one, the relative part, because when we begin to construct the URL, make it more dynamic, what year we want to import data from, etc., we actually need the relative part. And the content path here is also important when we have to switch from a get statement to a post statement, i.e. when we get the answer of a question, or post the question and get data back. And at the top, it also says something interesting, that it's a record that must be sent into the contents argument. And what is a record and how do you construct it? Don't worry, I will show you. And a small warning, I will open the advanced editor in Power Query Editor, so you'll see code. I know it's scary, but it's actually quite easy. Okay, let's switch to demos. The first example is the crime, and here I'm using data from data.police.uk, where we can actually specify a polygon, where we can get information of what crimes were actually committed in a specific period. And we can see around Newport there are a lot of dots, and we could filter it down to, I don't know what antisocial behavior is. We can filter it down, and I can zoom in. It's not the exact location, but the approximate location. Now, how did I get this data into Power BI? Well, we have to switch to the Power Query Editor, and let's also look at some documentation. A good place to find data that you can play around with is actually to search the web. Web APIs, open data, etc., and you will get a lot of data points available. And because we are here, I searched, of course, for crime data in Newport and found this site. Now, what I found was I could get street-level crimes. Where shouldn't I book the hotel, perhaps? Down here, I will get some examples that I can, for a custom area, specify after the question mark a poly equals some strange numbers. That's the latitude and longitude in combination, and specify a date. So I simply took that query here and did some modifications for the polygon that I wanted data from, and created a query. Now, this is just the text. So let's take this one and create a new query and use the web and simply paste this in. You have probably tried this as well. How many have used this before? A lot? Good. Click OK. Now it will connect to this site and hopefully return a JSON document in the same format as specified in the documentation. You can see the first step here is actually the source. It actually recognized that it's a JSON document that is returned by the service. So Power Query actually writes the information or the query for us. It converts this list of records into a table with records in each record. It expands the column, etc. Now, these automatic transformations is quite nice the first couple of times that you work with this, but you should be in control of what is happening. You also notice that the query here only contains data from January. We want, of course, some history, so we want to be able to go back in time. So we need to make this argument in our query dynamic. So I created a parameter where a user could enter a date. And I also created another parameter called it periods, where I can specify how many months do I want to go back in time. By having these two parameters, I can change the endpoint and, of course, how far back we want to go. I can do that in the Power BI desktop file, but when I publish the model to the server, I can also change the values in the service. The rest is sort of converting my first query here into a function. So let's jump into the advanced editor. This is really not a function, right? So we need to convert this by being able to create a state argument at the top. So I'll just take this one that I just created, go into the advanced editor, and to add a parameter to your query or convert it into a function, we use the parentheses and say, let's put in, you can expect that I will call this function with a argument called period, and use the equal sign and greater than, and this will convert the query into a function. I need to do one thing more, of course, and that is to change this value into what is coming from the argument. It's called period. Click done. And now it's converted into a function. We can try it. And which month should we take? We could take December. And voila, we have crime data from December 2022. In order to make it more a longer period and sort of calling this twice or 3 times, I will construct a list. So that's what I've done here. Now, what I've done is sort of create a list using the curly brackets and then dot dot and specified the parameter that's called periods. That is the number of periods. This constructs a list of 1 to 2. I convert that into a table. I add a custom table where I use the period and then subtract the month indexes in order to get the first date in every month back. And then I can invoke my custom function that I created where I specify the date and get a table returned from the function where I can get the data returned as a table. I can expand my function, and now I have 2 months of crimes in my table, and I then can expand the latitude and longitude as well in order to plot it on the map. And this means that if we switch to the table in our model here and have a look at the crimes, we will have data for 2 months ending at the 1st of January, and we have how many crimes do we have? 9,424. And let's try and change the period. So we'll go to edit parameters and say I do not want it to start in 20 here. I wanted to have a look at what happened in March last year. If we had the crime data already, we could see if having SQL bits in March, did it have an effect? Hopefully not. Click OK. Click Apply Changes. And hopefully at the bottom, we should see that the periods have changed. Nope. We'll just try again. Oops, not taking all. Sorry about that. Nope. Imagine that we had last year's data. Okay. Another data source could be, how many of you uses Dataverse?
Yes.
Yeah? Well, actually, you get an API for free in Dataverse. Because if you look at in your environment and go to tables, and let's have a look at the custom tables. And look at the table called store. Up here, you actually get an API link to the table data. So when we click on this, it actually extracts the top 10 records from the Dataverse table, and it constructs the web URL for us. So it says the org ID, and then CRM, etc., API data versus 9.2, the name of the table, question mark, $, top equals 10, i.e. returning the first 10 customers from my table. If I use this in my Power Query editor, let's make, and I do not pick the Dataverse connector. That could be another. I still use the web connector. Paste that in. Click OK. Now this one appears. And what should I pick? First of all, because the data is in our environment, I cannot use anonymous, right? Because unless we have sort of opened the gates for all our data in Dataverse, hopefully not, we can't use that. Can I use Windows in this case? No. Can I use Basic? No. Can I use the Web API? The key, this converts, if it has an API key, actually the key to in the post in the option statement. But what we need to use is the organizational account, and I can sign in. Click and now I'm signed in, and click connect. And voila, I have my top 10 customers based on the customer number, not the total sales. And the source that is created is actually the same. It still uses the web.contents, and I could change, of course, this one to I want the top 30. And now I have 30 stores. Any questions? No? Let's switch to the next example then. Now, in my company, we use economics to do all our accounting, and it's a cloud-based solution, and luckily, and of course, it has an API. But when we look at the documentation, it sort of begins to say strange things. I am not a developer, right? So the first couple of times when I looked at this, that was sort of, yeah, I couldn't understand what is happening. But what it says actually here, that you need to call an URL, the data type that is provided, that is actually, I expect to receive a JSON document with your with your information, and what I need as a header is an attribute called X app secret token, that is, and then contain that, in this case, demo, that is the secret token, perhaps not that secret, and the X agreement grant token, demo as well, and the content type should be application JSON. How can I get that into my Power BI Power Query question? Now, I won't go into how you get, in this case, in this solution, the app secret. More saying that if the documentation from your service provider is good, you'll be able to find information on how to authenticate. Because in order to authenticate, we need to know these things. So let's look at how we can do it. So I will start at the beginning. Now I've created an endpoint, or a parameter called endpoint. That means that I can, when I decide to switch my ERP system, and hopefully it calls the accounts, I can actually switch the pointer. Or if they have a developer environment or versus a product environment, I can switch that as well. The next thing is, now, when I start to use, in this case, anonymous authentication, when we publish this to the service, we will have to ask for entries in different accounting years. So I can't really have a query where I ask for 2020 and then 2021. It will then be relative my query or dynamic. So I have to put that into the argument in our options. It's called relative path, and if you do that, you'll be able to update this in the service as well. If you don't do it and make dynamic queries, you won't be able to update it. I'll show you where you can find out where it is, whether it's supported. Now, the last thing is actually to combine all of this in a record statement. And notice that I have square brackets around. This is how you construct a record. Now, the relative part, that's the how Power Query needs to know the name of the argument, and I set that into relative path that I constructed earlier, and then I specify the headers, and that must also be a record, so that's a record within a record. And I set the app secret token key to another parameter, app secret token, and the agreement as well. And then I have constructed what I need to send to the service. Now, don't take notes. This is actually the actual one, and I'll change it when the session is over. Now, the source is then constructed simply by web.contents, the URL, that's the endpoint, and then putting in the record containing the relative path and the authentication. This returns a JSON document that I can import. And in this case, I sort of needed to read the documentation again. What is actually returned by the function? In this case, it's returning a list, a collection that is a list. That is actually all the entries in 2019. Or at least that's what I thought. Because this second field in my record, what is that? Pagination. If I don't specify anything, I will only get 1,000 rows back. And when I look at my accounting figures, I would like more than the first 1,000 rows. I would like all of it, right? Otherwise, my bank account won't add up. And there's some interesting information here. You can see the results and the results without a filter, that actually tells me that there are over 6,000 records in my entries table that I need to extract. So we need sort of to run through this call and saying, I want not the first 1,000 every time, I want first page 1, then page 2, or rather page 0, and then page 1, etc. And how can we do that? We can create a function that actually has an argument where I can specify the record year. So hopefully my company will grow, so next year I will pay more bills, send more invoices, etc. So it's not 6,000. The endpoint is still the same. The relative part is now dynamic. I'm using the same, and then I drill down to the pagination, and then I use the Power Query function number integer divide, using the total number of records returned in the field results without filter, and divide that with 1,000. That means I'll get the figure 5. And then I can use that number to construct a list. That, first of all, calls which year do I want it to use. I will split if I had multiple years. I don't do that. I will then have the accounting year. Then I add a custom, an extra column with the number of pages that I want to know. And for each of the rows in my table, I want to add a column containing the number 0 to the number of pages for the given year. I expand that list. So now I get the number 1 to 0 for each of the year. And now I can call a function where I specify the accounting year and the page I want data from. And that is sort of what I've done in this get account entries in order to get the page and the year imported into Power Query. Okay. Now, next example. Any of you using Spotify? Any of you want to share your profile name? No. Then you'll see my playlist. Now, the Spotify has an API as well. You can do a lot with that. Let's just log in. And I've created a Power BI app in here. And we don't care about this. What is interesting is that when I have to authenticate using this, I need to supply the call with a client ID and client secret. So if you're interested, you're welcome to take notes. My playlist is very boring. Or perhaps a bit from the 90s. But using this makes me that I can use the API and I can authenticate with the client ID and a client secret. Now, in order to get the data out, I construct two parameters, a client ID and a client secret. I can put in a Spotify username. That's the same as my Twitter handle. How inventful am I? But let's have a look at how we can get to the data. You you can actually get to a list of my playlists. And of course, we read the documentation, and it says, okay, I need to actually, in my header, I need to specify the content type. What do you expect me to receive? You are getting some JSON information. And then I must create a token, and that should be bearer and a lot of information here. So I created a function called specify token, and that is this one. It should contain a name, and then we need to do this, right? Because when we read the documentation, it needs sort of base 256 something conversion. And how to do forward back, search the internet after Power Query, and voila, Ken Pulse had a blog post about that. So it converts my client ID and client secret to a binary file, it buffers it, and then it converts that into text. So it sort of scrambles the client ID and secret. And this is then used to call the API. Now the next thing is I need to then call the web contents using the endpoint, the users, specify my username, and then I can access playlists, and the headers is constructed application JSON plus my authentication, and it gives me this return. First the reference to the what I've asked for, then an items that will be the list of playlists that I have, and you can see that its default is 20, so I don't need to paginate, at least not now, because how many playlists do I have? 11. So I don't add pagination to this example. We could use the example from economics to do exactly the same here. And then it's just a matter of expanding the data, and then you can see the names of my my playlist here. We can get all sorts of other information. You can see julefrokost, that's Christmas lunch. So I'm in charge of a friend's dinner every year to create the playlist. And due to Corona, there's a bit of slack between the years. It's almost the same songs. For getting this contains then a column with the ID of the playlist. Then I use another function to get the to call my playlist an ID. That will give me a list of the IDs because we want to create a star schema, right, with the playlist and then the tracks. I can reveal that some of the same tracks are in different playlists. I rename it. I then invoke a custom function, exactly the same. Here I call it with I use the tracks in playlist API function, give it a playlist ID, and then I get a table of a table of the numbers that are in that playlist. And then we can not that one. I should have perhaps. Then we can see, can we actually make Power BI play as a song? Now, this Any other songs you want to listen to? Okay. And I can, of course, switch between my different songs. Now the music that you hear is only a preview because, yeah, that's what provided to me. But I have a link as well, so I could open the number in the playlist or the number in my Spotify from Power BI. Okay. Bonus part. I'll just discard the changes that I've made. Now, Twitter is all over ChatGPT, of course, and I've also created an example where I used Power Apps in order to use the open API to send data to that. But I sort of challenged myself to this. Could I actually do it in Power BI without Power Apps? Could I enter data in here without Power Apps? That was actually inspired because I played around with the open AI playground, and what is SQL bits? And I could submit, and then yeah, we get this sort of black magic or whatever, and then I click this one, view code. That's an web API. So by specifying a content type and an authorization, where it says, oh, you need to provide us with the text bearer and then your open API key in the header. And then the -d is actually the content. Here is data for OpenAI, and then some other parameters that you can set. And I said, that means I should be able to use Power Query, right? To do exactly that. But I sort of wanted to be able to change the question, right? It's not fun to see the same answer every time. But of course, we can utilize that to a whole bunch of questions. But for the fun of it, I sort of created this one. So if we go to transform data and click on edit parameters, I can now change the question down here to what is Power Query? Or what is Celtic Manor Resort? Click OK. Now, because I've changed the value of a parameter, I will be prompted for that I've made changes. So if we hit apply changes, it will know that I've changed the query, the question, and the question returns the value of the parameter, and that's the answer. Now, what I did was to create a parameter here called the OpenAI question. I created two parameters for the endpoint, and I used the completion. This is my API key. And then I have this query that returns the text. It will return, and that's equal the value of the parameter. And then it's a matter of constructing our web contents. And what the curl said to me was that we need the content type and the authorization, and that should be bearer and open API key. That's this one. We can then we need to construct the same text as you saw in the documentation, and that is simply some text concatenation in here. And then we can use this one, the custom. Notice that we use the web contents, we use the open API point, we use the headers constructed with the authorization and the content type. And then content, that's another argument we can use in the options record, where we use text to binary and put in the JSON document to get the queries sent to OpenAI. It will return, let's have a look at what it returns. It returns the information of what is actually used, when it was created, which model was used to actually construct this. And then it returns choices, and that is actually the result of and it's returned as a record. Let's just drill down to that. It's still a record when we drill into that. And then we get the text, and we can pull that out and present that at the end of here and return that to our Power BI desktop. Any questions?
We have some questions from the online audience. Earlier you showed how to use the secret and the client ID, but you expose them in a parameter. Is there a way to handle these securely?
Now I used a parameter, right? I could put it directly into the without using a parameter. I could put the text into the actual PBIX, but that is not secure. Anyone that then can download the data model will be able to open it. So in order to do that, we would probably have to go to Asia Key Vault, etc., in order to get that data out. And then you would need some extra APIs, etc., client secrets, etc., to get to those data.
I think there's another question related to that. Are these parameters currently visible for people viewing the content in Power BI Web, in Power BI Service?
If you have access to the data set properties, you can see them under settings and change them, if it's allowed. But as a report user, you won't be able to see them. You can expose them like I did with the question, etc. But otherwise, a normal user or report consumption user won't be able to see it.
And then a last question from the online audience. How to handle web APIs that only allow specific IP addresses to connect?
Don't. It's not supported, right? And then you have, because if you want it refreshed in the service, that comes from a totally different IP address, so it will only work in your Power BI desktop file when you are on that IP address. The last example is something that I want to draw your attention to, is actually a set of Power Query functions that Stepan, another MVP, has created, where we use the Power BI REST API admin functions to get all of the information about your tenant into your Power BI. We use them actually to create our documentation of all our workspaces, all our reports, etc. in our tenant. So in this case, you'll see that I've created a list of all the workspaces in my tenant. It's only the first 100. And then I can specify which capacity ID it's included in, and created one of the worst visuals I know, apart from the fish tank perhaps. But just to not reveal the names of our workspaces, hopefully. There's a link here to his excellent, let's see if I can hit it. It's included in my session material, but he has created Power Query functions for whatever you want to get out of your data. I've actually used this also to download PBIX files in order to, just for the fun of it, to see if any users used pie charts in their reports. Right? And then by using Power Automate, I could send them an email saying, don't do that. Okay. And another thing that you should learn from Stepan is actually his excellent way of documenting his Power Queries. I believe it's actually almost art. So I've opened the advanced editor, and this is copy-paste simply from his code. And what he has provided me here is with a Power Query functions that generates the authentication token that enables me to use the Power BI REST API. He also added links to documentation at below, and you can probably recognize some of the elements here that we actually call web.contents and use the login windows or the and we want to use the resource analysis Power BI API, and then we create the content, i.e. actually a post command, where we construct a URI build query string with the client ID, the resource, the grant type, and the client secret. All of this is set up in the Azure AD and create an application. And by using these client secret, Azure AD tenant ID, and application ID, we can actually get a bearer token out that we can use then when we call some of his other functions. Let's see if I can find my mouse. It's down here. So this is his function to create a table of workspaces. I won't go through that, but it needs a token. So when I'm using his, where is my mouse here? So in order to get the workspaces, I have created a function called fxgetGroups as admin. I put in a token and then ask for the first 1,000 workspaces. And voila, I have a table returned. I then can start to filter some other information around, and I can return it, giving me a table of all the workspaces in my tenant, whether it's migrated, whether it's deleted, what's the name, etc. And then we could use some of his other Power Query functions to get other information about the specific workspace, where we provide a bearer token and a workspace ID to get information of how many reports are there in the workspace, what data sets do you have, etc. Really, really cool example. Okay. That was it. I have provided some links, etc. in my presentation that will slide. There are some resources if you want to learn. When you start to work with it, download Postman and play around with that. That will help you. Chris Webb has created some awesome blog posts about relative paths, etc. Stepan, these APIs as a link, and then many more blogs and video logs. And then, of course, please evaluate, give feedback. And I'm around, so you can ask questions or examples. Yes?
Did you say earlier that the end user can update the parameters in service?
Yeah. Good question. What you should be aware of and check always before you publish your document or your model is that some data sources may not be listed because they have hand-authorized queries. That's a awareness that something should be changed. And I have, by purpose, not used relative path in order to trigger this, and you should always use that. Yes? Otherwise, join the stage, or I will come down here. Let's take the last one.
Yeah, when you were showing getting the bearer token from Azure or from the Power BI tenant, right? When you publish, do you ever run into this anonymous authentication thing because the root URL for the Power BI API actually requires authentication? But when you were showing it, I think you were passing like a client ID and client secret in the headers, right? How do you deal with that issue?
That's again back to the relative path. You must use only the endpoint, and then if you use other elements after the endpoint, some methods, etc., that should be included in the relative path. I have worked and made it work with Stepan's Power Queries, so have a look at those.
All right, thanks.
Otherwise, thank you very much for attending, and hope you